All right, so I was again, we were talking about this idea again of the noble savage and the relations between the non-Western world people and some of these Enlightenment thinkers, and the way that some Enlightenment thinkers were seeing that humanity had progressed, and others, like Rousseau, thought that they left a more natural state. Okay, and in a sense, you think, this is how a lot of there is that tension, right? Even to this day, and maybe it's always been this way, where you can look to the good old days, to the past, something simpler, an imaginary past at that. And here, Europe is going through this unprecedented amount of economic and technological advances, and then they're seeing people live in these different environments. I mean, think about how much clothes people are putting on in Europe, all these outfits, especially if you're the upper crust. I'm sure none of them were comfortable. And then you've got people who are naked and they're, having sex and relatively out in the open and under less confines, women bare-chested walking around. This had to seem like the very antithesis of their world, and perhaps idealized, while at the same time looking at them very like childlike, like, oh, look at how cute, these people back, doing these things on the original state. In any case, these ideas are going to have a lot of influences on various political ideologies that maybe these original thinkers did not intend to have. There was also, I talked about the contradictions of things, like even, with Thomas Jefferson. Much of these guys here are full of contradictions. Rousseau was quite a terrible human being, actually, at least based on my standards. I mean, he basically had like a trillion kids, a lot of kids, and he made his wife give him up for adoption. Just get rid of them. And he wrote about these in his Confessions. He did a lot of terrible things. He acted passionately on his whims, and he's one of the more interesting characters of this time period, but he's also interesting in a bad way. Kind of like, I don't know. He'd fit well into a reality TV show. That's all I got to say. So, I don't know. His Confessions, you can take a look and see that. But, they definitely had an uncompromising attack on aristocracy and monarchy. And he definitely, believed in people having sovereignty. I mean, here you look in the book, it says, Rousseau proclaimed the sovereignty of the people. Laws were to be determined by the general will, by which he meant the true and inherent interest of the community, not the vote of the majority. Now, that's where it gets tricky, okay? So let's think about that again. He says, laws were to be determined by the general will, by which he meant the true and inherent interest of the community, not the vote of the majority. So we're dealing with, in a sense, think about it like, the majority know there's a general will, what's inherently good, even if the people don't know what's good for themselves. You can kind of see how all these ideas are of interest and can lead to other problems of thinking that if implemented in actuality may look, a little distorted. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot we can say about him, and we're just exposing you guys to some of these characters. Thomas Paine, very, very interesting character out of the canon of so-called founding fathers of the United States. I guess we, say that. I think he's very interesting. He was a propagandist, an English propagandist who wrote Common Sense, which I think is really interesting. He basically wrote that the Bible was against having a monarchy. This is something he did to the masses. Usually monarchy is linked with the Bible, and he does something very opposite. He says, oh no, if you look in the Bible, God had prophets lead the Jews, and the Jewish people they demanded a king like everybody else. They didn't want to feel left out. And God was like upset with them about that. That's an account in the Bible. And God says, okay, I'll give you a king. Fine, fine. But, a good king will be good, but a bad king will be bad. And you're going to have to deal with this. And so then he kind of basically pins it down that, a monarchy was a sin of the Jews. And by the way, one could debate if it was anti-Semitic, but if you look at the nature of the writings of the prophets in the Old Testament, it's the Jewish people and their covenant with God and things that are good for them and things that are bad for them. And the discourse of the prophets is where Jews get things wrong and where they get it right. So in a sense, Thomas Paine is kind of playing that role of the prophet, saying, well, just like when they worshipped Baal, they had it wrong. When they asked for a king, they also got it wrong. And look how we've suffered under this wrong decision. I'm paraphrasing him, but this is kind of how he pawns it off. What's even more interesting is he doesn't even believe in the Bible, okay, when you read his other works. But he writes this tract to motivate a majority Christian population to be against the monarchy. And this also shows you how propaganda works and how intellects are able to kind of tap in to their constituency, their target audience, okay? Later, he's going to write, criticizing the Bible, but also say that he's against atheism. He's an interesting character. He thinks the French Revolution will go too far. And he believes that this rationality of a human being has to be redeemed. And in a sense, it's kind of a deist spiritual moral philosophy that he's seeming to try to play this middle ground. But he had also, though, influenced a lot outside of that, this idea of natural rights. So, you're seeing this stuff, as I talked about the scientific revolution, we've talked about social science and this idea of what's scientific, that there's even looking at economics somehow embedded into the natural world. And so here, rights, that there's innate rights. This is something that we see in Thomas Jefferson's writing, right? Inalienable rights. I mean, what's interesting about this, if you think about it, unless you believe in God, in other words, the spiritual texts, what would we have as rights? What's interesting is this is a secular world, so to speak, who acts like atheists, claims to believe in God, and still advocates morality like a religious person, as if there's certainty about something. And this is an interesting set of conditions that we see here that I just want you to point out, that we still see sometimes today. But in any case, okay, I gave you a little bit of exposure to them. There's that picture, the Rousseau and Voltaire duking it out. Now, what about women in the Enlightenment? So, Rousseau, for all of his, idea of going back to the natural state of humanity, he's assuming still that there's separate spheres of males and females. And there's going to be a debate and a discussion about, women's rights to vote and all these different things. Excuse me, I'm going to go back here. Voltaire, as we saw, learned a lot of science from women. Women did play a much stronger role. They led these salons of these discussion groups. They did contribute much, but at the same time, they were marginalized. Yet we find them writing, okay? Marquis de Condorcet, if I said her name wrong, sometimes I mess up French names, forgive me, but 607 talks about her publishing on the admission of women to the rights of citizenship, talking about all women who owned property. Okay, she's still thinking of her class being given the rights to vote. And, some people really criticizing this idea of a separate sphere. More interesting, I find, is the lady Mary Wollstonecraft. You see her name on 607. She appealed to extending civil and political rights to women, and she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And she advocated for the same education that girls should get as boys. In other words, she didn't believe that there should be this natural separate sphere. Okay, and she writes a strong case on behalf of women. It seems to me that women in this time period really do show themselves, the ability to shine, but I think that chauvinistic culture was just too strong to give them that window that was open, more full space. By the way, Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter is Mary Shelley. It would be Mary Shelley, as in who wrote Frankenstein. Interesting legacy. And Godwin, the father of Mary Shelley, was a kind of aristocratic anarchist. So an interesting family. Then Mary Shelley apparently consummated her love to the married, controversial romantic poet Percy Shelley on the gravestone of Mary Wollstonecraft. The interesting literary characters of history never bore us with their lifestyles, do they? Anyhow, so we have that aspect to address, and then we have sexuality, and I just that we heard about Casanova, right, comes from an actual legendary character that was quite scandalous. Okay, so even now we say that guy's being a Casanova. Okay, it comes from this person. Now, when we say someone's being sadistic, sadism comes from Marquis de Sade. He's an interesting character that you can find documentaries on him. He was somewhat rehabilitated by the Surrealists in the 20th century. In the S&M crowd, he writes some of the most grotesque. I mean, I have a lot of his books just because I'm a historian and I read stuff. But I started reading some of it and it gets interesting, and then all of a sudden it's like I want these things out of my brain as quick as possible. They're really extreme, to say the least, and demented. And he was high up in the aristocracy, and he apparently was raised in very brutal conditions in a monastery that made him think very negative about Christianity. He ends up getting some prostitute to step on the cross, and he gets in trouble for blasphemy. He spends most of his time in prison, in a very nicely furnished prison, writing all of these sexual fantasies that he probably didn't have the opportunity to enact. But and some were almost impossible. But he really just challenges all of our senses of morality, and maybe is seen as a darker side of the aspects of the Enlightenment. Again, for the Surrealists in the 20th century, he's going to be seen as almost liberating, to liberate our minds from all confinement. But I don't know. If you look into Marquis de Sade, I'll let you decide what you think. But an interesting character at the very least to know about, and very influential in many aspects. Okay. So we end up seeing a lot of things that occur today. Public libraries, the idea of an encyclopedia, Diderot is really responsible for that. Museums, coffee houses where people sit around and talk politics and have poetry readings. This was all stuff that was coming in vogue then. Freemasons, there's a lot of Freemason theory, conspiracy theories. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, we'll address it. I don't believe that the world is controlled by these kind of organizations, but I believe that elites make these kind of organizations, or people in power. Okay, if that makes sense. That's my thought on that, and the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. All right, and then so salons at the time were not just places with hair being done like now, but actually, discussions led by women, and that people could be intellectually, engaged with each other. And in the middle of all this, there were many pseudoscientific literature that were taking place as well. What I want to do is I'm going to end here. And then my next lecture is going to be a combination of ending out this chapter, introducing the French Revolution, and then introducing you to the documentaries I'm going to have you watch on that. Okay?